The sound of rain on church windows will never leave me. It tapped against the glass in a steady rhythm as I stood in the front pew, staring at two caskets side by side. My parents had always been inseparable in life, and now they were bound together in death, my mother taken by a long illness, my father following her just 3 days later. I could barely breathe as I clutched my daughter Lily's trembling hand, trying to hold myself together. Then, in the middle of that unbearable silence, my husband Mark leaned close, his voice cutting into me like a blade. "I want a divorce, Elena. It's over." 6 words whispered over the bodies of my parents changed everything I thought I knew about love, family, and loyalty. Before I continue, let me pause for a moment. If you're listening to my story right now, I'd love to know where you are in the world. Please share your country in the comments, and if this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more true stories of betrayal and justice. My name is Elena Brooks, and I'm 46 years old. For most of my adult life, I was the kind of woman who never questioned the sacrifices that came with marriage. I was raised in a modest household where my father worked construction until his hands grew stiff with age, and my mother ran our home with equal parts gentleness and grit. They showed me by example that love meant showing up every day, even when it was hard. When I met Mark at 24, he seemed cut from the same cloth, ambitious but warm, eager to build a life together. He had a sharp smile and a voice that carried confidence, the sort of man people noticed when he walked into a room. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony my parents helped plan. I remember the way my father squeezed my hand before walking me down the aisle, whispering, "He'd better treat you right, or he'll answer to me." Back then, Mark did treat me well, or at least it felt that way. He bought us a tidy colonial-style home in the suburbs, and I left my first counseling job when Lily was born, believing him when he said, "A child needs her mother more than anything." We built a routine that looked perfect from the outside. He worked long hours in sales, always chasing promotions, while I baked for school fundraisers, kept the house warm, and made sure Lily never missed a bedtime story. For years, people told me we were the couple who had it all. Mark was charming at company dinners, the kind of man who remembered names and made people laugh. I was the steady presence at home, making sure Lily grew up secure and loved. Even my closest friend Tessa admired what she called my storybook marriage. She'd often tell me how lucky I was to have a husband who provided so well, and I would smile, not realizing how fragile our storybook truly was. Still, little things began to shift over time. Mark stopped asking about my day, brushing off my words with a distracted nod. He grew impatient with Lily's chatter at the dinner table, muttering that he needed quiet after long meetings. At family gatherings, I noticed him checking his phone constantly, his expression somewhere between bored and irritated. I told myself he was under stress, that success demanded sacrifice, but a quiet unease began to settle in my chest. My parents, bless them, saw more than I did. Mom once asked me, her voice gentle but firm, if Mark still made me laugh. I had no answer, only silence, and she let the question hang between us. Dad, though proud of Mark's professional rise, often muttered that my husband's eyes looked too hungry, like a man chasing something he could never quite catch. I brushed off their concerns, convinced they were being protective. But in hindsight, they saw cracks in the foundation long before I dared to admit they existed. Lily, sensitive and observant, began to notice too. She was only a teenager then, but she had my mother's sharp intuition. She'd crawl into my bed some nights and whisper that Daddy seemed far away, even when he was home. I reassured her with all the conviction I could muster, though deep down her words echoed the doubts I tried so hard to ignore. Looking back, it's almost laughable how carefully I convinced myself that everything was fine, that we were just weathering a rough patch. But the truth is, my life had already begun to unravel. I just hadn't reached the moment yet when all illusions would shatter. That moment would come cruel and unforgettable, whispered in my ear as I stood grieving over my parents' graves. At first, I tried to convince myself that what happened at the funeral was a moment of cruelty born from stress, a careless slip of the tongue that he would regret. But Mark never spoke of it again. He came home that night and shut himself in the guest room, leaving me to comfort Lily alone as she cried herself to sleep. The next morning, he appeared in the kitchen in his pressed suit tie, nodded, perfectly coffee in hand, as if nothing had happened. He asked about traffic reports, reminded me to pay the utility bill, and left for work without acknowledging that he had broken me in two only hours earlier. I began to notice things I had overlooked before, moments that once felt like minor irritations, but now carried a heavier weight. Mark no longer asked about my day or Lily's grades. He treated us like background noise. When Lily tried to tell him about an essay she'd written, he brushed her off with a distracted wave of his hand, his eyes fixed on his phone. She looked at me, then her voice trailing off, and I realized she had already started to understand. He was slipping away from us piece by piece. One evening, I asked him to help Lily with a project. She was building a family tree for her history class, and she wanted to include photos of her grandparents. I thought it might soften him, reminding him of where we'd come from. He looked at the paper for less than a minute before handing it back, saying he was too busy with a new account at work. Lily lowered her head, and I could see the disappointment burning in her cheeks. I sat with her afterward, cutting out the photos myself, pretending that his absence was normal when we both knew it wasn't. The excuses grew more frequent, the distance more obvious. He began coming home later, sometimes not until long after midnight. His shirts carried faint traces of perfume that didn't belong to me, scents both floral and sharp. When I asked about them, he dismissed my questions with irritation, claiming that clients hugged him at meetings or that women brushed past him at crowded restaurants. I wanted to believe him, but the answers never rang true. My parents had always taught me that marriage was work, that sacrifice was part of love. I clung to those lessons even when my heart told me otherwise. I told myself that Mark was tired, that sales was a punishing field, that his sharp words and cold stares were nothing more than stress. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't repair with patience or understanding. Lily noticed the tension long before I admitted it aloud. She started closing her bedroom door more often, hiding in her music, trying not to hear the arguments muffled through the walls. When I asked her if she was all right, she forced a smile, but her eyes gave her away. She was carrying the weight of his absence too. My daughter, still so young, was already learning that promises could be broken, even by the people you trusted most. Mark's indifference reached a cruel height the week my mother grew weaker. Hospice had become our reality, and I spent nights at my parents' house helping my father spoon soup into her trembling hands, reading aloud when she could no longer hold a book. I begged Mark to come with me to sit by her side, to show her even a shred of respect. He shook his head, his tone flat. "I'm not good with that sort of thing. You handle it." And so I did alone, while the man who had shared my life for nearly 2 decades excused himself from the most important farewell I would ever face. At the funeral, while I stood beside Lily holding her as she sobbed for her grandparents, Mark kept his distance. He glanced at his watch, checked his phone, and offered practiced smiles to relatives who shook his hand. I watched him, then realizing he had already moved beyond us, already living in another world where we no longer existed. The whisper about divorce wasn't a slip, it was his truth delivered in the cruelest way he could find. In the days that followed, I lay awake at night replaying every word, every cold glance, every lie I had forced myself to believe. The house felt different now, hollow and heavy, as if the very walls carried his disdain. Lily would come into my room sometimes, curling against me with her stuffed blanket, like she was a little girl again, whispering questions I couldn't answer. "Mom, do you and Dad still love each other?" I would hold her tightly, my throat aching, knowing that honesty would break her heart too soon. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I found myself at the kitchen table staring at a framed photo of us taken years ago. We looked happy, then radiant, even with Lily perched on Mark's shoulders and me laughing beside them. I studied that image for hours, trying to reconcile it with the man who now slept soundly in the guest room, untouched by grief, untouched by the destruction he had caused. I wanted to believe there was still something left to salvage some hidden spark buried beneath the ash of our marriage. But every gesture, every silence, every lie told me otherwise. I could feel the truth pressing against me unrelenting. Our life together was slipping away, and soon I would no longer be able to pretend. At night, when the house finally grew still, I would lie awake in the darkness, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Those were the hours when the truth pressed down hardest. I could hear Lily shifting restlessly in her room sometimes, whispering on the phone to a friend, her voice low and anxious. More than once, I caught fragments. "I think they're splitting up, or Dad doesn't even try anymore," and my heart clenched because she was right. My daughter, at just 17, was carrying burdens no child should have to carry. I tried to keep the routines alive, convincing myself that order might protect us. I packed lunches, folded laundry, and cooked dinners, even when Mark didn't bother to join us. Sometimes he would come home after we'd already eaten, claiming he'd been with clients, though his cologne carried a scent I didn't recognize. Lily noticed too, glancing at me across the table, with questions she didn't voice. She didn't need answers to know. She was old enough to see the distance growing larger every day. There were moments when the silence between us felt heavier than any argument. I would sit at the kitchen table after the children went to bed, staring at the cold dishes and the empty chair where Mark should have been. I longed for the man who used to reach across the table just to hold my hand, the man who once danced with me in the kitchen on ordinary nights. That man was gone, replaced by someone who looked like him, but moved through our home as if he were only passing through. One Saturday morning, I tried to bridge the gap. I suggested we take Lily on a college tour, just the three of us, hoping it might remind him that we still shared something worth saving. He sighed, muttered something about work obligations, and disappeared into his office with the door firmly shut. I stood in the hallway with the pamphlets in my hand, the rejection stinging sharper than I let Lily see. I told her we'd go together instead, just the two of us. She forced a smile, but I saw the disappointment flicker in her eyes. She still wanted her father to show up for her, even if I had stopped expecting it. The weight of my grief lingered everywhere. Losing my parents had already hollowed me, and Mark's betrayal only deepened the emptiness. I caught myself crying in the shower, muffling the sound so Lily wouldn't hear. At night, I would press a pillow to my face to keep the sobs from carrying through the thin walls. I didn't want my daughter to know how broken I felt, how much of myself had slipped away in the silence of his rejection. Even small moments cut deeply. When Mark did join us for dinner, he acted as if we were colleagues instead of family. He asked Lily about her grades, but never listened to the answers. He complimented the meal as though it were an obligation, his eyes drifting toward his phone before the words even finished. The warmth that once filled our evenings had drained out, leaving only cold formalities. Lily barely spoke on those nights, pushing food around her plate until I suggested she excuse herself. I began to notice how much she was changing under the strain. She spent more time in her room, her once bright laughter replaced with long silences. I worried about her, about the weight she carried, without saying it aloud. One evening, I went to check on her and found her sitting cross-legged on her bed, sketching quietly in her notebook. She looked up, her eyes rimmed red, and asked me the question I dreaded most. "Mom, are you and Dad going to make it?" I sat beside her searching for words, but all I could manage was to pull her into my arms and tell her I loved her. It wasn't an answer, but it was all I had left. The truth was, I no longer believed in the life I had spent years defending. I had made excuses for Mark's absence, convinced myself his sharp words were the result of stress, and told myself the children were resilient. But the cracks were widening, and no amount of patching could hold us together. Each day felt like walking across ice I knew would give way beneath me. In the rare, quiet moments, I thought about my parents, about the kind of love they had built, and the devotion that carried them until the end. Their marriage had been far from perfect, but it had been steady and true. I realized how far I had fallen from that example, how much I had settled for indifference dressed as responsibility. It was a bitter truth, one I swallowed alone in the dark hours when no one was watching. One evening, after another silent dinner, I stepped outside onto the porch while Lily finished her homework. The night air was cool, the neighborhood quiet, but inside me, everything churned. I gripped the railing and whispered into the darkness, asking my parents how to go on, how to protect my daughter when I could barely hold myself together. No answer came, only the hum of distant traffic and the ache in my chest. That was when I understood something I hadn't admitted before. I was no longer just grieving the loss of my parents. I was grieving the loss of the life I thought I had, the marriage I had defended, and the man who had walked away long before he whispered those words at the funeral. In the weeks after the funeral, I tried to distract myself by sorting through my parents' belongings. Their house still smelled faintly of lemon polish and the lavender soap my mother always kept by the sink. Every drawer I opened carried memories, the neat stacks of my father's work shirts, the recipe cards stained with sauce, the folded blankets she crocheted for winter nights. I thought I was ready for the task, but grief has a way of creeping up in small details. A half-burned candle on the nightstand left me in tears for nearly an hour. While sorting through a box of my mother's personal things, I came across a sealed envelope tucked between her hymn book and an old photo album. My name was written on the front in her careful handwriting. My hands shook as I tore it open, unsure of what she might have left me. Inside was a short letter and a small brass key. The letter was written in her familiar, graceful script, and each word felt as if she had reached back from beyond to guide me. She told me that love required honesty, and sometimes the hardest truth was the one that protected us most. At the bottom, she explained the key belonged to a safety deposit box at the local bank. The following morning, I drove there alone, my palms sweating against the steering wheel the entire ride. The clerk recognized the authorization and escorted me into a small, windowless room with a long wooden table. My heart pounded as I slid the key into the lock and pulled the box free. Inside was a thick folder bound with a rubber band and several manila envelopes. I didn't know what to expect, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found. The first envelope held photographs, grainy but clear enough. They showed Mark with another woman, the same one in every picture. They were holding hands across a cafe table, sitting shoulder to shoulder in a car, even kissing in the dim light of a parking lot. I recognized her immediately. It was Melissa Turner, an event planner Mark had worked with more than once, a woman who had smiled at me at Christmas parties and complimented my dress while hiding the truth. The next envelope contained financial documents. My mother had gathered copies of statements showing withdrawals from accounts I hadn't even known existed. There were transfers into names I didn't recognize, and several notations suggesting Mark had diverted money from Lily's college fund. My chest tightened as I flipped through page after page, realizing how long he had been hiding things from me. At the bottom of the folder was a printout of emails carefully collected. I scanned the messages, my stomach turning as I read his promises to Melissa. He wrote about leaving me, about building a new firm together once he secured enough clients and funds. He told her she was the partner he truly needed, both in business and in life. My hands trembled as I dropped the pages onto the table. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was calculated. I sat there in silence, trying to catch my breath. My mother had known. Somehow, through her illness, she had pieced together what I had refused to see. She hadn't confronted me, maybe because she wanted me to discover it when I was ready. But she left the evidence trusting I would find the strength to face the truth. I gathered everything carefully, sliding the envelopes back into the box and securing the rubber band. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about the years I had wasted defending him, the nights I had cried in silence while he lived a double life. But for the first time in months, my tears gave way to something else. Beneath the grief, I felt a sharp edge of resolve. That night, after Lily went to bed, I spread the documents across the kitchen table. I studied every page, memorizing dates and details, forcing myself not to look away. I needed help, someone who could tell me if what I had was enough to expose him. I remembered a name my father had mentioned once, a former police detective who had become a private investigator, someone he trusted to handle sensitive matters. The next morning, I called. His name was Dakota Jensen, and his calm, steady voice was the first sign of hope I'd felt in a long time. When we met later that week at a quiet diner, I slid the folder across the table. Dakota reviewed the contents with the careful eye of someone who had seen this before. He asked precise questions, noting details I had missed, and finally looked up at me with a grave expression. "He's been at this for a long time," he said quietly. "And it's not just infidelity. If these accounts tie back to his firm, he's setting himself up for charges." I felt my throat tighten, but I forced myself to meet his eyes. "Can you prove it?" He nodded slowly. "With time, I'll need to follow the money track, his movements, see who else is involved. But yes, this is enough to start." As I walked out of the diner that day, the air felt different. I was no longer the woman whispering into the night for answers. I had them now, written in black and white, handed down by a mother who refused to let me remain blind. My grief had opened a door I could never close again. At home, Mark barely looked up when I walked through the door. He was in the living room, phone pressed to his ear, smiling in that practiced way he saved for clients. I stood there for a long moment, watching him, seeing not my husband, but the man who had stolen from me, from our daughter, and from the life I thought we had built. For the first time, I didn't feel small in his shadow. I felt steady, almost calm. I kept the folder hidden in the locked drawer of my desk, but its presence weighed on me every time I walked past. The evidence my mother had gathered was no longer just paper. It was a map leading me toward a truth I could no longer deny. Every evening, once Lily had gone upstairs, I would sit at the table reading through the documents again until I could recite the dates and numbers by heart. I knew that if I wanted to protect my daughter and myself, I needed to move carefully, not recklessly. Dakota became my quiet anchor during those weeks. He followed Mark, discreetly documenting his late-night meetings with Melissa, photographing the cars they drove, even tracing the restaurants where their bills conveniently ended up on company accounts. Each time we met, he handed me a manila envelope filled with his findings. I accepted them with steady hands, though my stomach knotted tighter with every new page. It was no longer suspicion, it was proof, stacked higher and higher until it threatened to topple. The next step was legal protection. And for that, I needed someone fierce. A friend of my mother's recommended a seasoned attorney named Margaret Walsh. She had a reputation for being sharp, unflinching, and loyal to the women she represented. I met her in a quiet office downtown, the walls lined with thick law books and framed certificates. She listened as I laid out the story, her expression unwavering as I slid the folders across her desk. She leafed through the documents slowly, her fingers tapping against the table as she read. When she finally looked up, her voice was steady. "You have more than enough to file for divorce on grounds of infidelity and financial misconduct. But if you want to dismantle him properly, we need to move strategically. Timing will be everything." I nodded, the truth of her words sinking deep. For years, Mark had controlled the pace of our lives. Now, I would be the one to choose when and how this would unfold. At home, I played my part carefully. I cooked dinners, asked about his day, and nodded through his excuses about late meetings. I let him believe I was still the quiet wife he could dismiss, the one too timid to fight back. Inside, though, I was no longer waiting for scraps of affection. I was watching him, memorizing the lies as he spoke them, filing them away beside the growing collection of evidence that would soon crush him. Lily sensed the tension, though I tried to shield her as best I could. One evening, while we washed dishes together, she glanced at me and whispered, "Mom, are you okay?" I smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Some things just take time to work through." She didn't press further, but I knew she saw more than I wanted her to. Protecting her from the storm while preparing to unleash it was the hardest balance I had ever faced. In the weeks that followed, Dakota uncovered more than I imagined. Not only was Mark funneling money into secret accounts, but he and Melissa were actively courting several of his firm's largest clients, promising lower rates once they launched their new practice together. He was stealing the very foundation of the career that had given him his reputation. With each revelation, my anger settled into something colder, more precise. This wasn't just betrayal of our marriage, it was a campaign of deceit stretching into every corner of his life. Margaret guided me through the process of securing my own financial stability. Quietly, we opened a separate account in my name, one he couldn't touch. I began transferring small amounts of money from household funds, careful to keep it hidden from his sharp eyes. She also advised me to gather every important document, birth certificates, property deeds, tax records, and store copies somewhere safe. I spent several late nights at the copier in Margaret's office. My fingers stiff from sorting paper, but each stack gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. At night, when I finally crawled into bed, I felt the shift inside me. The woman who once begged for scraps of attention was gone. In her place was someone my parents would recognize, someone steady, patient, and unwilling to be silenced. My revenge wouldn't come through shouting matches or slammed doors. It would come through silence, precision, and truth revealed at exactly the right moment. One evening, I caught a glimpse of Mark through the living room window as he sat in his car smiling down at his phone. His expression was soft, in a way I hadn't seen directed toward me in years. He lingered there for several minutes before finally walking inside his face, shifting back to the mask he wore at home. I watched quietly, my anger no longer sharp, but focused. Let him smile for her now. Soon, he would have nothing left to offer her but ruin. Every lie he told became another stone in the wall I was building against him. Every late night, every unexplained charge, every dismissive glance, it all fed the fire that no longer burned hot, but glowed steady. I moved through our home as if nothing had changed yet. Inside, I was a woman transformed. I wasn't waiting for him to end this anymore. I was preparing to end it on my terms. By spring, Mark and Melissa's new firm had its polished name on the door, and their smiling photos splashed across the local business journal. The article praised their innovative partnership and featured a staged picture of them standing shoulder to shoulder, their hands resting lightly on a stack of law books. I clipped it from the paper and set it on my desk beside the file my mother had left me. To the outside world, they were the golden pair on the rise. To me, they were thieves sitting on a powder keg, and I held the match. Margaret and I spent weeks preparing the filings. She combed through every detail, aligning Dakota's reports with the financial statements I had gathered. Each document was cross-checked and organized into neat binders. When we move, she told me we move all at once. No warning, no chance for him to scramble. I nodded, keeping my voice steady. The thought of confrontation no longer frightened me, it steadied me. The morning we acted began like any other. I packed Lily's lunch, kissed her forehead, and sent her off to school. Then I drove downtown, a folder on the seat beside me, the weight of it heavier than stone. At Margaret's office, we signed the last of the divorce filings. From there, she handed sealed packets to a courier who would deliver them to Mark's firm, the State Bar Association, and the district attorney's office. At the same time, Dakota sent digital copies of the surveillance reports to Mark's largest client, the one he had been trying hardest to steal. The cascade had begun. By noon, my phone began to buzz. A neighbor called, her voice trembling with curiosity. "Elena, have you seen the news? They're talking about Mark?" I turned on the television just in time to catch his face flashing across the screen. The anchor reported allegations of embezzlement and misconduct, citing documents obtained by investigators, and noting that complaints had been filed with the bar. Photos of him and Melissa appeared on the screen, their smiles frozen beneath the scrolling headline, "Local Attorney Accused of Fraud and Infidelity." That evening, when Mark finally walked through the door, his mask had cracked. His tie was loosened, his face pale, and he dropped his briefcase on the floor with a heavy thud. He didn't look at me at first, only poured himself a drink with a shaking hand. "You knew," he muttered finally, his voice tight. I held his gaze calm and steady. "I didn't need to know, Mark. You left a trail a mile wide. All I did was stop ignoring it." His anger rose quickly, but I didn't flinch. For years, he had controlled the tone of our house with his moods. But that night, his fury fell flat against me. He accused. He deflected. He begged for time, but I said nothing more. Silence was sharper than any reply. He stormed upstairs, slamming the door while I stayed in the kitchen, my tea cooling in my hands. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of his anger. The fallout was swift. By the next morning, reporters gathered outside the firm's glass doors, cameras clicking as clients walked briskly away. Melissa was photographed alone, her face tight with strain, as she tried to explain the chaos. Within days, the district attorney's office announced an inquiry into the missing funds, and the state bar suspended Mark's license pending investigation. The man who once prided himself on his spotless reputation was suddenly the headline for every wrong reason. At home, the silence grew heavier. Mark moved between rooms like a ghost, his phone pressed to his ear, muttering to lawyers and associates. Lily watched him carefully, her brow furrowed, finally whispering to me one night, "Mom, is he going to jail?" I wrapped an arm around her shoulders and told her gently, "That's for the courts to decide." She nodded, pressing her face into my shoulder. She didn't ask more, but her relief was clear. She saw what I saw. His power was gone. One evening I came home, to find Mark sitting in the darkened living room, the glow of the television flickering across his face. He looked older, worn, and for the first time, small. "You've ruined me," he said quietly, not with anger, but disbelief. I stood in the doorway, my voice calm. "No, Mark, you ruined yourself. I just stopped protecting you from the truth." He had no reply. He turned back toward the screen, and I walked upstairs, closing the door firmly behind me. The man who once whispered divorce over my parents' caskets now sat drowning in his own disgrace. Every secret he thought was safe had been pulled into the light, and every lie he told was collapsing under its own weight. Watching him unravel, I felt no joy, only a steady certainty. The reckoning he had mocked me for never came through my anger. It came through the truth he couldn't outrun. The weeks after the scandal broke were filled with headlines that refused to fade. Each morning, the newspaper carried fresh details about the investigation, and each evening, the local news replayed clips of Mark ducking away from reporters. The man who once thrived on attention now recoiled from cameras, his shoulders hunched, as though he could shrink himself out of sight. At home, he moved in silence, packing documents into boxes and making calls behind closed doors. But nothing he did slowed what was already in motion. The district attorney filed charges for embezzlement and fraud, citing the misappropriation of client funds and the scheme to transfer accounts into hidden ledgers. Melissa's name appeared alongside her role impossible to deny. The state bar issued a formal suspension barring him from practicing until the case was resolved. He tried to reach out to former colleagues for support, but the same men who once toasted him at conferences now refused his calls. The empire he had built on charm and manipulation was collapsing brick by brick. Lily and I sat together one evening as the television replayed a clip of Mark walking into the courthouse. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and his face, once practiced in composure, looked drained and uncertain. My daughter turned to me quietly and asked, "Mom, is this what he deserves?" I hesitated before answering, brushing her hand with mine. "This is what happens when the truth finally comes out," I said. She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the screen, seeing her father in a way she never had before. The trial began months later in a downtown courtroom lined with wooden benches and bright overhead lights that left nothing in shadow. I sat toward the back, my lawyer Margaret by my side, while Lily stayed home with a close friend. Mark entered in a dark suit, his tie slightly askew, Melissa a few paces behind him. She avoided my eyes, her expression brittle as if she had aged years in a matter of months. The prosecution laid out the case with precision bank statements showing the missing funds testimonies from clients who had been misled, and Dakota's photographs documenting Mark's meetings and transfers. Melissa, faced with the weight of the evidence, agreed to testify. She spoke in a low, trembling voice about how the plan had unfolded, naming Mark as the architect. I listened without flinching, each word confirming what I had already known. The man who once dismissed me as blind and weak was being unmasked by the very woman he had chosen over his family. When it was his turn to speak, Mark tried to charm the courtroom, insisting he had made mistakes, but never intended harm. His words fell flat, his tone practiced but hollow. The judge, a stern man with a patient gaze, reminded him that intent did not erase the harm done, nor the trust broken. I watched as Mark's shoulders slumped, his confidence drained away under the weight of truth. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. The sentence, 8 years in federal prison restitution of the stolen funds and permanent disbarment. As the judge read the words, Mark stood motionless, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the floor. The room was silent, except for the sound of the gavel striking wood final and unyielding. I did not cheer, nor did I cry. I simply sat still, my hands folded in my lap, as if the quiet dignity my parents had lived with had settled into me at last. Watching him led away in handcuffs, I felt the echo of my mother's handwriting on that letter. The reminder that the hardest truths are the ones that set us free. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps, their microphones raised high. They asked about the betrayal, about Melissa's testimony, about the family left behind. I offered no statements, only walked past them with my head held steady. Margaret shielded me with her presence, and I realized I no longer needed to defend myself. The story was no longer mine to explain. The truth stood on its own. At home, Lily greeted me at the door with cautious eyes. "Is it over?" she asked. I pulled her into my arms, holding her close. "It's over," I said softly. She rested her head against my shoulder, and for the first time in months, I felt the house exhale, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for the storm to pass. Mark's world had crumbled in public view. His reputation destroyed, his career ended, his freedom taken. Melissa disappeared from the headlines soon after, her name remembered only as a footnote to his fall. The firm they built together was dissolved, its sign removed from the downtown office within weeks. What remained was silence, and in that silence, I found a strange peace. The night after the verdict, I stood by the window of our home watching the quiet street where the streetlights flickered against the wet pavement. For the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing on my chest. Justice had been served, and the shadows Mark cast over our lives had finally lifted. Lily's laughter slowly returned to the house light, and unguarded in a way I hadn't heard since before the whispers of divorce. She sketched again, filling her notebooks with bright images instead of dark lines. She began to plan for college with excitement instead of worry, and watching her bloom again reminded me that survival was never just for me. It was for her future too. I took steps of my own. I returned to my counseling work with renewed purpose, focusing on women who had endured betrayal and hardship. Sitting with them, hearing their stories, I understood how my own scars had become a kind of strength. What had once felt like ruin had instead given me a new voice, one my parents would have been proud to hear. Walter, my father-in-law, remained in Lily's life, visiting on weekends and fixing small things around the house. He never excused his son's choices, only shook his head quietly when Mark's name came up. In his way, he showed Lily that not all family ties had to be broken, that loyalty could still exist, even when trust had been shattered. Mark's name faded from the headlines over time, replaced by newer scandals and louder stories. But for me, his absence was its own kind of closure. The man who once thought he held all the power had been reduced to a memory of handcuffs and shame. I didn't gloat, and I didn't linger on his fall. Instead, I built a home where his shadow no longer reached. In quiet moments, I thought about my parents. I imagined my mother's gentle voice telling me I had finally faced the truth, and my father's steady hand guiding me through the storm. Their legacy wasn't only in the evidence my mother left behind. It was in the resilience they had planted in me, long before I knew I'd need it. Looking back, I realized the true victory wasn't in Mark's sentencing or in the collapse of his firm. It was in reclaiming my dignity, in showing my daughter that betrayal cannot erase self-worth. We cannot choose the cruelty others deliver, but we can choose how we rise once the silence breaks. Before we close, I'd love to know, have you ever found strength in the very place you thought you'd lost everything? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.